All right, welcome to our deep dive into Jerome Bruner. Looks like we've got quite the collection here. Some book chapters, introductions, even some writings from Bruner himself. So you want to understand this guy, his ideas on the mind, language, and education, right?
Yeah, you've got it. It's a rich landscape, that's for sure.
Okay, well, let's unpack this then. And just a heads up, you might be surprised by Bruner. He was kind of an intellectual rebel in a way, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. He pushed those boundaries,
Yeah.
Psychology, for him, it wasn't just about those traditional experiments, the kind of standard stuff. He was drawn to those big questions, like, how do we even understand the mind?
Yeah, the role of culture, like the very nature of knowledge, that kind of thing.
Right, right. He was what you might call a philosophical psychologist.
Oh, I like that. So not your typical psychology textbook stuff then, huh?
Definitely not. You see, back then, psychology was kind of struggling with its identity.
Yeah.
Trying to be a hard science, all objective and measurable.
Right, cause and effect, that whole thing.
Exactly. But Bruner, he wasn't afraid to say, hey, human experience is messy. There's meaning, interpretation, all that.
So it's not just like stimulus and response, it's the why, the stories we tell ourselves, the cultures that shape our minds. Like that chapter on folk psychology we have here.
Ah, yes. That's perfect. So some folks back then, they argued that our everyday understanding of minds, like how we know other people have thoughts and feelings, they said it could be like reduced to simple causes, but
Like a computer almost.
yeah, kind of. But
Mhm.
Bruner said, no, it's more complex than that. Think about a child. How do they learn that other people have their own minds? It's through interacting, through sharing meaning, not just simple cause and effect.
Like those proto conversations he talks about, right? Parents pointing, making faces with their baby, responding to those little noises.
Exactly. It's creating a shared world, not just input and output.
And I bet that ruffled some feathers back then in the psychology world.
Oh, you bet.
Yeah.
Back then, the focus was on the brain, mapping it all out, finding those neural correlates, explaining everything mechanically.
Right. But Bruner's saying, hey, hold on, there's this whole cultural context we need to consider.
Yeah. And that's right around the time of the cognitive revolution, right?
When the mind was making a comeback in psychology, what was Bruner's role in all that?
Oh, he was central to it. His new look experiments, those were groundbreaking, really. He showed that perception, how we see and hear the world, it's not passive.
It's not just a mirror reflecting reality back.
Right. It's influenced by expectations, motivations, our backgrounds. I mean, he even found that, like, economic background could affect how kids perceive the size of coins.
Wow, so our minds are more like prisms then, huh? Taking reality and refracting it.
That's a great way to put it. And it challenges this idea of an objective observer,
Hmm.
which has implications for everything, research, how we understand ourselves.
And all this while he's co-founding the Center for Cognitive Studies at Harvard? Wow. But one thing that's really interesting to me, it's his view on immaturity.
Oh, yeah.
He sees it as a key to human potential.
Mm,
Seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it?
yeah, right. But think about it. Primates, especially humans, we have this long childhood compared to other species. Years of dependence, being kind of helpless.
We're wobbly little things for a long time.
And Bruner argues this is an evolutionary advantage, not just some quirk. All that play, exploration, that's what allows our complex abilities to develop.
Language, abstract thought, all that.
Exactly. It's not about rushing kids to grow up. It's giving them that space to explore, to be playful, to learn by trying things out.
Makes you rethink how we view childhood, you know? All that play and exploration. It's not just wasted time, it's crucial.
Absolutely. And has big implications for how we see education, child development, even what it means to be human. It's not just a stage to rush through.
Now, I know he also had some pretty different views on how we learn language.
Oh, yeah, he challenged that idea that it's all about instinct.
Right, like it's all hardwired in our brains.
Well, he didn't deny some biological basis. He focused on the social and cultural parts. Early language use, it's all tied up with action, how we interact with the world.
It's like those proto-conversations, again, right? The pointing, gesturing, shared attention. It's not just absorbing words, it's using them to figure out the world around us.
Exactly. And that leads to his critique of education systems. Those
Yeah.
that emphasize rote memorization over actually understanding and using what you learn.
Knowing that versus knowing how, right?
Yeah. He wanted education to be about engaging with ideas, problem solving, being creative.
And that brings us to his own experiences as a teacher, right? Those excerpts you sent.
Oh, yeah. He was known for being, well, a dynamic teacher. engaging, that's for sure.
So what was his teaching style like, from what you've read?
I mean, there are lots of stories, but basically he created this environment where students felt empowered to explore, to debate, to question things. It wasn't about filling their heads with facts. It was about sparking that curiosity,
Yeah.
helping them become like lifelong learners.
So different from that traditional sage on the stage model of teaching, huh?
Totally. And, it kind of reflects what we're doing here on the deep dive, exploring ideas together, making connections, finding new ways to see things.
Exactly. And Bruner's vision, it goes way beyond the classroom, right? His work on cultural psychology, that's where he really pushed things further.
Oh, absolutely. He was a pioneer in exploring this back and forth between mind and culture, challenging that view that culture just molds the mind like it's this external force.
So it's not a one-way street. It's like we also shape culture through what we do, through our beliefs, the stories we tell.
Exactly. And that leads to one of his most profound insights, that our sense of self, our identity, it's deeply tied to these cultural narratives we inherit and the stories we choose to tell about ourselves. But before we get into all that, let's pause here for a second. What's striking you so far about Bruner?
Honestly, I'm already kind of rethinking how I think about learning, about childhood, even about knowledge itself. It's like he's offering a whole new lens to see the world through, one that's both more complex and, I don't know, more hopeful somehow. And to think this is just the beginning.
Right. We've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
It is amazing, how something like childhood play or how we learn language, it can make us rethink these big ideas about the mind, about culture. And you're right, this is just the tip of the iceberg with Bruner, really.
I'm really caught on this idea that, our sense of self is shaped by these cultural stories. It makes me think about, all the stories we hear growing up. Fairy tales, myths, history, even what we see on TV and stuff. Did Bruner believe that these stories actually shape how we think and act, do you think?
Absolutely, yeah. He was fascinated by how powerful narrative is, not just in how we understand the world, but how we understand ourselves, too. He saw narrative as like a fundamental way we make sense of things, of experience, how we organize our thoughts and feelings, how we even create a self, a coherent self in this, crazy complex world.
It's like we're all characters in our own stories, huh? Always revising, rewriting. As we go through life, meet new people, have new experiences. And our culture, it gives us those building blocks, those archetypes, those recurring themes that shape our own personal story. It's pretty wild when you think about it.
And it's not just the stories we're told, right? It's also the stories we tell ourselves. Those inner narratives we create to, make sense of our own lives.
Yeah.
And Bruner believed that this process, this narrative building, it's influenced by the cultural tools we have, the language, the values, our whole way of understanding things.
This reminds me of what you said earlier, how language isn't just expressing thoughts, but it actually shapes how we think. That seems to connect with this idea of cultural stories.
You got it. That's one of Bruner's biggest ideas, really influential stuff. His language isn't just neutral, it actually shapes how our minds work, how we understand the world, even our sense of self.
It's like those experiments, the Sapir-Whorf stuff, right? Yeah. Where they show that the language you speak actually affects how you see colors.
Yeah. Mind-blowing, isn't it? That something like language can have that much power. And Bruner went further with this, saying that the structure of language itself, the grammar, the words we use, it shapes how we think about time, space, cause and effect, even our emotions. He saw language as this cognitive toolkit, like mental lenses.
Wow, that makes me rethink everything I thought about language. It's not just communication, it's like world building, shaping how we see reality. And this brings us back to education, right? If language is so powerful, then how we teach it, how we expose kids to different ways of using it, that's got to be crucial.
Absolutely. Bruner, he argued that education, it should be more than just facts. It should be about developing those cognitive tools, those linguistic lenses that allow students to make sense of the world in more complex ways.
Yeah.
He said, teach language not as rules, but as this living system of meaning making, a way to explore and understand the world.
So it's not just about grammar and vocabulary lists.
Right. It's about using language to, engage with the world.
And this all connects with his ideas about different ways of learning, right? The, what was it? Enactive, iconic, and symbolic modes.
You got it. It's like he's saying we need to use all of those, not just focus on language. He really believed in this multimodal approach,
What do you mean by that?
So each way of representing things, enactive, iconic, symbolic, they offer a unique way to understand things. Using all three, we learn in a richer, more meaningful way.
Can you give an example? How would this work in a classroom?
Okay, imagine you're teaching about gravity. right? A symbolic approach. You just give the definition, maybe a formula. But multimodal, you might start with, having kids drop objects, different weights, see how they fall.
So they're actually feeling how gravity works, literally.
Yeah. Then it maybe move to iconic, have them draw diagrams, visual representations, and then finally bring in the symbolic language to talk about the concepts, the principles.
That's so much more engaging than just reading a definition. It's like building a foundation using all these different ways to understand.
Exactly. And it connects to his idea of the spiral curriculum, revisiting concepts as kids get older,
Yeah.
but each time adding complexity.
Yeah, so you're building on what they already know.
Exactly. That's Bruner, an education that meets kids where they are,
Yeah.
that builds on their understanding,
Yeah.
uses different ways to represent things, a truly meaningful learning experience.
Such a powerful vision for education, But Bruner also acknowledged the challenges, right?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to culture and social justice. He saw that culture could be both freeing and limiting, right?
Absolutely. He was worried about how cultural stories could, perpetuate stereotypes, prejudice, inequalities, and he felt education had a role in challenging that, in creating more inclusive just ways of understanding ourselves in the world.
It goes back to his idea of the cultural self, right? How
Yeah.
our identity is shaped by the stories we inherit, the stories we tell ourselves. It's like he's saying we have a duty to look at those stories critically, to challenge the harmful ones and create new ones that are, more just and fair.
Yeah, he believed in education's power to foster critical thinking, to question assumptions, to empower people to make change. He saw it as essential for dismantling oppression, creating a more just world.
And that's why Bruner's work is so relevant now, right? We're in a time where cultural stories are constantly being challenged, identities are changing, and we're facing all this, this legacy of injustice. Bruner's ideas give us a way to understand this complexity, work towards a better future.
And he didn't just talk about it. He was involved in educational reform, creating curricula, teaching methods that reflected his vision. A true advocate for social justice in his work and his actions.
It's inspiring to see how he lived his ideals, using his intelligence to make a real difference in the world. But I'm curious, how did other academics respond to his ideas? He was challenging some pretty fundamental stuff, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He was controversial, especially in psychology. His emphasis on meaning, interpretation, all that, some saw it as a threat, like it was undermining the scientific objectivity of the field.
Yeah, it's like he was ahead of his time, wasn't he? Challenging the status quo. It really shows that sometimes the most groundbreaking ideas come from questioning. Those things everyone takes for granted, those basic assumptions about how things work.
Totally. And Bruner, he never backed down from those debates, those intellectual clashes. He saw them as, a way to refine his own thinking, to make his arguments stronger, and to really engage with people who saw things differently, a real dialogue.
Yeah. It's like he embraced that tension,
Yeah.
between tradition and innovation, between being rigorous, but also being willing to push those boundaries. It makes me think about how we put knowledge in these boxes, psychology, education, anthropology, like they're separate things, but Bruner, he just moved between them all.
He was interdisciplinary before it was cool. He got these artificial boundaries. They limit how we understand things. He saw how everything's connected, how something you learn in one field can shed light on something completely different.
It's like he was weaving this tapestry of knowledge, pulling threads from everywhere.
To create a richer, more complete picture of what it means to be human, right?
Exactly. And that brings us back to his work on cultural psychology, where he challenged that traditional view of the mind, like it's this isolated thing, separate from culture, from context.
He said, forget that. You can't understand the mind without understanding the cultural tools, the symbols, the practices that shape how we think, how we see the world, how we even see ourselves. Culture is not something outside us, it's something we create, something we're constantly making and remaking through how we interact with each other.
It's like that quote, man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. Geertz, the anthropologist, said that. Bruner seems to be on the same page, saying we're all weaving these webs of meaning, these stories that shape our reality.
That's a great connection. And Bruner was fascinated by those webs, those cultural narratives that shape who we are as individuals and as societies. He believed that by understanding them, we could understand ourselves better, our place in the world.
So it's like we're all storytellers in a way, huh? Constantly creating narratives to make sense of life, our relationships, everything. And those stories, they have power. They shape our beliefs, our values, even how we act.
Right. And he wasn't just interested in the stories themselves, but also how they're told. The language, the metaphors, the symbols. Language was key for him.
Which brings us back to education one last time. If these cultural narratives are so powerful, then how we teach them, how we expose kids to different ways of thinking, that matters a lot.
Absolutely. Bruner, he thought education should be more than just info dumping. It should be about critical thinking skills, encouraging kids to question those dominant narratives, to explore other perspectives, to create their own stories.
So it's about empowerment, giving them the tools to shape their own understanding.
Exactly. A more transformative kind of education, one that sees the power of narrative to shape not just our minds, but our societies, even our future.
As we wrap up here, I'm really struck by how much ground Bruner covered,
Yeah.
language learning, culture, identity. And he did it all with this sense of curiosity, compassion, and real intellectual rigor. It's impressive.
And he never lost sight of that connection to the real world, to the problems people face. He was a scholar, but also an educator, an activist. He wanted to use what he knew to make things better. A real role model.
This deep dive has been amazing. It's made me question things, learn so much, and it's sparked this desire to keep learning more. It reminds you that learning is a journey, not a destination, and it can take you to unexpected places, but you end up with a richer understanding of the world and yourself.
Well said. And I think Bruner would be happy knowing his work is still sparking that sense of wonder, that thirst for knowledge, that desire to explore those big questions.
Well, this deep dive may be over, but the exploration goes on, right? Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you'll keep diving deep into those ideas that make you curious, that ignite your passion for learning. Keep exploring, everyone.